made a comment before, man, and you said if it wasn't for Tupac, Jay Z, he wouldn't be as big as he is today. What makes you say that?
Well, I don't say that lightheartedly. I say that factually. So when you deal with the back during that time, and we got to deal with, like I said, I'm from Maryland, and I remember Jay Z. He's authentic. He's a hustler. He's everything that he said he was. In his records, like I said, I know Eastern Shore, what they was doing, him, Emery, and all of them, like I said, and much success to them at this particular point. But when I take you back to 95, 96, let's deal with the fact of the matter. The fact of the matter is Tupac was the king. He was on top of the food chain. Let's be clear. And so when you deal with that, All Eyes on Me dropped. Was that the 14th, 13th of February, right? The first week, 566,000 units, I believe. And so when you deal with that fact, those numbers speak for themselves. Then was that July 4th, Tupac dropped Hit 'Em Up. And so once again, out of the stratosphere, he controlled all of the lane. Fresh out of prison, fresh off of Me Against the World, which did double platinum. So, okay, now here you come. You have Jay-Z, Biggie's partner, friend, and so on and so forth. And so Jay-Z drops Reasonable Doubt on March 25th, 1996. So by him, when he dropped that album, you got to understand Tupac was at the top of the food chain once again. And so now he drops the album. In the first week that he dropped that album, the first single on it was Ain't No Nigga. Lukewarm reception, if anything, you know what I mean, with Foxy Brown on it and so on and so forth. So he drops the single. His first week sales were 43,000 records. So when you deal with that, we just factually dealing with the numbers. So 43,000 units, that's not a lot of units compared to what Tupac was doing. Tupac was basically doing that every 3 days from that perspective. So now you go on down the line, Biggie, he's on Reasonable Doubt. They do Brooklyn's Finest, right? That's where the thing comes in and the riff comes in between Tupac and Jay-Z and how he felt. He felt that anybody that was riding and siding with Biggie, you know what I mean, he had a problem with too after the situation that happened with the shooting and all of the disenchantment that they had at that particular time. So when you deal with that and you think about it, you say, well, okay, well, why would I say that he was successful? Tupac was responsible for Jay-Z's success in dealing with that. The fact of the matter is, you go to 2006, right? So in 2006, it took Jay-Z basically 10 years to sell 1.6 million records. It took Jay-Z 10 years to sell what Tupac sold basically in a month. You understand what I'm saying? So those numbers basically tell you what it is. Okay. So we know what happened in Vegas. Tupac goes to Vegas. Everything that happened in Vegas, unfortunately, he was assassinated. He was murdered in Vegas. We know what that is. And so now you deal with the time span. People kind of knew who Jay-Z was, but really it wasn't buzzing like that. I remember when the record Ain't No Nigga came out, and they were playing it on the radio. Me personally, I thought it was a hot record. You know what I mean? But I don't think people were rushing to the polls. I think most of those records, those 43,000 in that first week, had basically came from the tri-state area, like New York, and people supporting him from there. So now Tupac goes to Vegas, he gets murdered. And most people didn't even know Tupac had another album ready, coming out, and so on and so forth. So when the word comes, this new album coming out, Machiavelli, basically, when it comes out, there's this skit in the beginning of the album. And this guy who comes on and he basically says, people are changing their, rearranging their chart positions, their chart dates, their release dates, because Tupac dropped this album. Now, this is 2 months after Tupac died. This is November 5th, right? That this album comes out. And in the beginning of that skit, basically, Tupac says, and Jay-Z from Hawaiian Sophie fame. At that particular point, people didn't really know who Jay-Z was. We're talking about Tupac's album that's dropping after his death. People are rushing the polls. So when you put that album on in the beginning and you hear the first, because you want to hear what Tupac left behind. You know what I mean? The artist is gone. So the artist's still here, right? And so the elevation of what that means to hip hop, what that means to the community, what that means overall to the culture at that particular time is enormous. And people rushed the polls. I think it was 660,000 copies that it did in the first week. So now, okay, once he does that, at the end of the day, he drops that. He says he calls Biggie the notorious P.I.G. and he calls Mobb Deep Mob Sleep, right? Anybody who knows, and I'm gonna revert back to something that I heard recently. I forgot who said it, but Tupac saying anybody's name, right, at that particular time was a blessing. So now we go into Jay-Z's next album, right? After that, Life and Times. What was that? 138,000 units that he sold. You know what I mean? So that goes in to show you the popularity and the boost that you can't listen to me, Art. You couldn't buy that kind of publicity. Even today, right now, Jay-Z couldn't go and say, yeah, an artist's name and give them that kind of credibility that Tupac could give you by saying something negative about you or having a problem with you. You couldn't buy it. He was the greatest. He was the top of the food chain. And how he did it, it's never been done before. You come out of jail, dude, and you move. You were moving basically 500,000 records almost a week. You know what I mean? Nobody's ever really done that of a double album. So by the time Jay-Z had released his album on March 25th, right, The Reasonable Doubt, Tupac had already sold, I would say, almost 3 million records when you times it up because it's a double album. So you do times two. You know what I mean? From that perspective. So like I said, you couldn't buy that. And so that's why I say, I think Jay-Z understand that too. I think he, being a realist, Pac gave him a boost that you couldn't buy. You couldn't buy a boost like that from nowhere, period, bottom line. And so when we tally up the numbers all together, you go from Jay-Z's album Reasonable Doubt, 43,000 the first week when he came out, and then you go to the Life and Times, you go to 138,000. Once again, those numbers only show you the impact that Tupac had on his career. That's Tupac right there. Period. And another thing, when you deal with the fact is, on that second album, he really didn't have a hit single, like he did to come, later on in his career. Once again, like I said, Tupac, dissing you was like Tupac handing you a gold or platinum record. You know what I mean? And like I said, Jay-Z understands that.